While avoidants appear to handle relationship endings with cold indifference and seem unaffected by their ex-partner's absence, the reality is that no contact creates a uniquely devastating psychological experience for them that compounds over time rather than diminishing. Unlike anxious partners who experience immediate intense pain that gradually heals, avoidants experience delayed but increasingly severe psychological consequences that can persist for years because their attachment system operates on a different timeline, and their coping mechanisms actually amplify rather than resolve their emotional distress. The delayed attachment response. Why their pain comes later. The most misunderstood aspect of avoidant psychology is that their attachment system operates on a delayed reaction mechanism that makes the full impact of loss hit them months or even years after the relationship ends. While anxious partners experience immediate devastation, avoidants initially feel relief that gradually transforms into profound regret and loss as their psychological defenses fail to maintain their emotional equilibrium over extended periods. During the first 30 to 90 days of no contact, avoidants typically experience what psychologists call deactivation euphoria, a flood of relief that validates their decision to end the relationship and confirms their belief that emotional distance was necessary for their psychological survival. This initial period creates the illusion that they're handling the separation better than their ex-partner, when in reality they're simply experiencing a different timeline for processing attachment loss. The delayed reaction occurs because avoidants have spent their lives suppressing attachment needs and emotions through psychological defense mechanisms that can temporarily override their natural human needs for connection and bonding. However, these defenses require enormous psychological energy to maintain and eventually begin to fail under the sustained pressure of genuine loss. Months 3 to 6 typically mark the beginning of their delayed attachment response as the novelty of independence wears off, and they begin to notice the absence of specific benefits that their relationship provided. Unlike the immediate recognition of loss that anxious partners experience, avoidants slowly become aware of missing practical support, emotional comfort, and the sense of security that their partner provided without conscious recognition. The 6 to 12-month period often represents the peak of their delayed attachment pain as they fully comprehend what they've lost while being unable to undo their decision or repair the damage their behavior caused. This timeline means that avoidants often experience their most intense grief and regret precisely when their ex-partners have begun to heal and move forward, creating a tragic mismatch in emotional timelines. By months 12 to 18, many avoidants experience what can only be described as attachment panic, a psychological crisis where they simultaneously recognize the value of what they lost while confronting their own role in destroying it. This delayed recognition often creates more profound and lasting psychological damage than immediate grief because it's accompanied by self-awareness about their own destructive patterns. The delayed nature of their response also means that avoidants often miss the window for potential reconciliation, as their recognition of their mistake typically occurs after their ex-partner has emotionally detached and moved forward. This timing creates additional psychological trauma as they realize they destroyed something valuable through their own choices and defensive patterns. Most cruelly, the delayed attachment response means that avoidants often experience their most intense longing for their ex-partner precisely when that person has become least available for reconnection. This mismatch in emotional timelines creates a unique form of psychological torture, where their recognition of love and loss comes too late to matter practically. The delayed response also prevents avoidants from receiving the social support and sympathy that people typically offer immediately after breakups. By the time they're experiencing their most intense grief, others assume they've moved on and are no longer available to provide comfort or understanding about the relationship loss. The compounding effect how their pain gets worse over time. Unlike other forms of emotional pain that tend to diminish with time and processing, the psychological impact of no contact on avoidance actually compounds and intensifies over extended periods because their coping mechanisms prevent healthy grief processing while creating additional layers of psychological distress that accumulate rather than resolve. The compounding effect begins with their inability to process the loss in real time due to their emotional suppression patterns. While healthy grief involves feeling the pain, processing the emotions, and gradually integrating the loss, avoidants suppress the initial emotional impact and miss the natural window for healthy grief processing. This suppressed grief doesn't disappear. It accumulates in their psychological system and emerges later with increased intensity. Each month that passes without contact adds new layers of recognition about what they've lost, creating cumulative psychological weight that becomes increasingly difficult to manage. Month 3 brings awareness of missing daily companionship. Month 6 reveals the absence of emotional support during stress. Month 12 highlights the loss of shared future planning. And month 18 forces confrontation with genuine loneliness and isolation. The compounding effect also occurs because avoidants typically try to replace their lost relationship through new romantic connections, casual relationships, or increased social activity. However, these replacement attempts consistently fail to replicate the specific emotional safety and acceptance that their previous relationship provided, creating repeated experiences of disappointment that reinforce their sense of loss. Their attempts to convince themselves that they're better off alone become increasingly difficult to maintain as evidence accumulates that contradicts this narrative. Each failed replacement relationship, each moment of loneliness during stress, and each recognition of their ex-partner's continued growth and happiness chips away at their defensive rationalization and forces greater acknowledgement of their loss. The social comparison aspect also compounds their distress as they observe their ex-partner moving forward, building new relationships and achieving personal growth while they remain stuck in patterns that prevent genuine connection. This contrast between their stagnation and their ex-partner's progress creates additional psychological pain that layers on top of their original loss. Their inability to discuss their grief openly due to their emotional suppression patterns means they lack healthy outlets for processing their accumulating pain. While others might seek therapy, talk to friends, or engage in healthy grief processing, avoidants typically suffer in isolation, allowing their psychological distress to compound without relief or resolution. The recognition of their own role in creating their suffering adds another layer of compounding pain. As they become aware that they lost something valuable through their own choices and defensive patterns, they experience not only grief about the loss, but also self-anger and regret about their decision-making and emotional patterns. The practical consequences of their choice also compound over time as they realize how much more difficult life becomes without genuine partnership during challenges, stress, and major life events. Each situation where they would have benefited from emotional support reminds them of what they chose to give up and adds to their cumulative sense of loss. The unique torture of avoidant no-contact experience. The no-contact experience creates a unique form of psychological torture for avoidants because it forces them to confront their attachment needs while being unable to satisfy them due to their own previous choices and behavior patterns. This creates a psychological trap where they simultaneously crave connection and recognize their inability to create or maintain it healthily. The torture begins with their gradual recognition that they may have destroyed the best relationship they were capable of having through their own emotional limitations and defensive behaviors. This recognition creates profound regret that cannot be resolved through action because their ex-partner has typically moved beyond availability for reconciliation. Their monitoring of their ex-partner's life through social media or mutual friends becomes a form of self-inflicted psychological torture as they witness growth, happiness, and new relationships that they're not part of. Each positive development in their ex-partner's life serves as evidence of what they lost while highlighting their own emotional stagnation. The inability to reach out due to no contact boundaries creates a sense of powerlessness that contradicts their usual need for control in relationships. Avoidants typically manage relationship anxiety by maintaining the option to withdraw or return at will, but no contact eliminates this control and forces them to sit with their feelings without escape routes. Their attempts to convince themselves that they don't miss their ex-partner become increasingly futile as evidence accumulates that contradicts this narrative. The psychological energy required to maintain denial in the face of mounting contradictory evidence creates exhaustion and internal conflict that compounds their emotional distress. The recognition that they may never find another person willing to provide the emotional acceptance and support that their ex-partner offered creates existential anxiety about their capacity for future relationships. This anxiety is particularly acute because they recognize that their emotional limitations make them unsuitable partners for most people. Their inability to apologize or make amends for their behavior creates a sense of unfinished business that haunts them indefinitely. Unlike other relationship endings where closure can be achieved through communication and resolution, no contact prevents the kind of accountability and amends making that might provide psychological relief. The torture is intensified by their awareness that they caused their own suffering through choices they now recognize as mistakes. The self-inflicted nature of their loss creates a particularly cruel form of psychological pain because they cannot blame external circumstances or other people for their situation. Their observation of their ex-partner thriving without them often forces recognition that they may have been holding their partner back rather than contributing positively to their life. This realization that they were actually detrimental to someone they claimed to have loved creates additional psychological torment. The physical manifestations of their suppressed grief, sleep disturbances, appetite changes, concentration difficulties, and general malaise, often emerge without conscious connection to their relationship loss, creating confusion and distress that they cannot easily address or resolve. The social isolation that amplifies their suffering. No contact typically coincides with broader social isolation for avoidants, because their relationship patterns and emotional unavailability often extend to friendships and family relationships, leaving them without adequate support systems during their delayed grief process. This isolation amplifies their suffering by forcing them to process their loss alone without the social connections that typically help people navigate difficult emotions. Many avoidants have superficial social connections rather than deep friendships that can provide emotional support during difficult times. Their pattern of emotional unavailability often means that friends don't feel comfortable offering intimate support, or may not even be aware of their emotional struggles due to their tendency to present as self-sufficient and emotionally detached. This stigma around men expressing emotional vulnerability particularly affects male avoidants, who may feel unable to admit that they're struggling with the loss of a relationship, especially if they were the ones who chose to end it. This social conditioning forces them to suffer in silence while projecting an image of strength and indifference. Their family relationships often mirror their romantic patterns, with similar issues around emotional expression and vulnerability that prevent them from seeking or receiving support from family members during their difficult period. If their avoidant patterns develop due to family dysfunction, these relationships may actually compound rather than alleviate their distress. Professional environments typically don't provide appropriate venues for processing relationship loss, and avoidants often lack the personal relationships outside of work that would allow for emotional processing and support. Their social isolation means they have few outlets for the growing psychological pressure they're experiencing. The competitive and superficial nature of many adult social environments makes it difficult for avoidants to find appropriate context for expressing vulnerability or admitting that they're struggling with loneliness and regret. Their social circles may not provide safe spaces for genuine emotional expression. Their tendency to isolate when experiencing emotional distress creates a reinforcing cycle where their pain drives them further away from potential sources of support, increasing their isolation and amplifying their psychological suffering. This isolation becomes self-perpetuating as their withdrawal makes reconnection increasingly difficult. The absence of their ex-partner's social circle often eliminates many of their social connections, leaving them with fewer relationships and social activities than they had during the relationship. This social reduction compounds their sense of loss by making their life feel emptier and less socially rich. Their inability to discuss their relationship loss openly means they cannot receive validation, perspective, or advice that might help them process their experience more healthily. Instead, they're left to ruminate alone on their regrets and losses without external input or support. The practical consequences that compound emotional pain. Beyond the emotional and psychological impact, no contact with someone who provided significant practical and emotional support creates cascading practical consequences that compound the avoidant suffering by making daily life more difficult and stressful while highlighting the value of what they lost. The loss of daily emotional regulation that their partner provided often manifests as increased stress, anxiety, and difficulty managing normal life challenges. Tasks that felt manageable with emotional support become overwhelming when faced alone, creating additional stress that compounds their psychological distress. Financial implications may emerge if their partner contributed to household expenses, career support, or financial planning. Managing finances alone often proves more expensive and stressful than shared financial responsibility, creating practical hardship that serves as daily reminders of their loss. Domestic responsibilities that were shared or managed by their partner suddenly become their sole responsibility, often revealing how much practical support they received without acknowledgement. Cooking, cleaning, home maintenance, and life organization often become more difficult and time-consuming. Social obligations and maintaining friendships often become more challenging without their partner's social skills and energy. Many avoidants relied on their partners to manage social calendars, maintain couple friendships, and provide social buffering during events, leaving them more isolated and socially awkward after the relationship ends. Career challenges often emerge when they lose the emotional support and encouragement that help them manage professional stress and pursue career goals. The absence of someone who believed in their potential and provided emotional stability during work challenges can significantly impact their professional performance and satisfaction. Health and wellness routines often deteriorate without their partner's influence and support. Many avoidants relied on their partners for motivation to exercise, eat healthily, or maintain medical care, leading to declining physical health that compounds their emotional distress. Major life decisions become more difficult to navigate without their partner's input, perspective, and emotional support. The absence of someone who knew them well and could provide thoughtful advice creates additional stress during important life transitions and decisions. Emergency situations and unexpected challenges become more difficult to manage without their partner's practical and emotional support. Illness, family crises, or other emergencies that would have been manageable with partnership support become overwhelming when faced alone. The unique regret pattern of avoidance. The regret experienced by avoidants differs qualitatively from normal relationship regret because it combines recognition of their loss with awareness of their own role in creating that loss through patterns they now understand were self-destructive. This awareness creates a uniquely painful form of regret that persists because it cannot be resolved through external action. Their regret typically focuses not just on losing their partner, but on recognizing that they lost someone who genuinely loved and accepted them despite their emotional limitations. This recognition that they rejected unconditional love due to their own fears creates profound self-anger and regret that compounds over time. The regret also encompasses recognition that they may have lost their best opportunity for genuine partnership and family building. As they age and their options become more limited, the recognition that they destroyed their most compatible relationship often creates existential despair about their romantic future. Their regret often includes awareness that they hurt someone who didn't deserve their treatment. Unlike regret about mutual relationship problems, avoidants often recognize that they damaged someone who is genuinely trying to love them, creating guilt and shame that persists indefinitely. The pattern recognition aspect of their regret involves understanding that they may repeat the same destructive behaviors in future relationships unless they address their fundamental attachment issues. This recognition that they're likely to destroy future relationships creates an additional psychological burden. Their regret typically includes recognition that they chose their fears over love, comfort over growth, and isolation over vulnerability. This awareness that they made choices based on psychological defense rather than authentic desire creates deep disappointment in their own decision-making and character. The timing aspect of their regret is particularly cruel because it typically peaks when reconciliation is no longer possible. Their recognition of their mistake often comes precisely when their ex-partner has moved forward emotionally and practically, making their regret practically meaningless. The absence of closure or ability to make amends often leaves their regret unresolved indefinitely. Unlike regret that can be addressed through apology, behavior change, or reconciliation, their regret must be carried permanently because their ex-partner is no longer available for resolution. The long-term psychological consequences. The psychological impact of no contact on avoidance often extends far beyond the specific relationship loss and creates lasting changes in their emotional functioning, self-perception, and approach to future relationships that can persist for years or decades. Many avoidants develop what therapists call phantom relationship syndrome, where they continue to mentally maintain connection with their lost partner through imagination, social media monitoring, or fantasy scenarios. This psychological continuation of the relationship prevents healthy grief processing and keeps them emotionally attached to someone who's no longer available. Their attachment system often becomes even more defended after experiencing the pain of significant loss, making them more avoidant in future relationships as a protective mechanism against experiencing similar psychological devastation. This increased defensiveness often makes them less capable of healthy relationships over time. Depression and anxiety disorders often emerge or worsen following significant relationship loss, particularly when compounded by social isolation and inability to process grief healthily. These mental health consequences can persist for years and significantly impact their overall quality of life. Their self-concept often shifts to include recognition of themselves as someone who destroys good relationships, creating lasting damage to their self-esteem and confidence in their ability to maintain healthy partnerships. This negative self-concept often becomes self-fulfilling in future relationships. Trust in their own decision-making often becomes impaired as they recognize that their choice to end the relationship was based on fear rather than rational assessment. This damaged trust in their own judgment can affect decisions in all areas of their life. Their capacity for vulnerability often becomes further impaired as they learn to associate emotional openness with eventual pain and loss. This reduced capacity for vulnerability makes future intimate relationships even more difficult to develop and maintain. Sleep disorders, appetite disturbances, and other physical health consequences often persist long after the initial relationship loss, creating ongoing health challenges that serve as daily reminders of their psychological distress. Social anxiety often develops or worsens as they become more self-conscious about their relationship patterns and worried about others judging their emotional limitations or relationship failures. Why their suffering matters and why it doesn't set. Understanding the unique and compounding psychological consequences that no contact creates for avoidance serves several important purposes, but it's crucial to maintain perspective about what this suffering means and doesn't mean for your own healing and decision-making. Recognizing their delayed and compounding suffering can provide validation that their apparent indifference immediately after the relationship ended didn't reflect the true impact of losing you. This understanding can help heal wounds created by their seeming ease with the separation and provide perspective on their actual emotional capacity. Understanding their psychological timeline can help explain their delayed attempts at reconnection and provide context for their eventual recognition of their mistake. This knowledge can help you evaluate whether their later expressions of regret represent genuine growth or simply delayed grief response. However, their suffering doesn't obligate you to provide comfort, accept their eventual apologies, or give them opportunities to demonstrate change. Their psychological consequences are the natural result of their choices and behavior patterns, not your responsibility to resolve or ameliorate. Their delayed recognition of their mistake doesn't erase the damage their behavior caused to your emotional well-being, self-esteem, and ability to trust future partners. The fact that they eventually experience consequences doesn't undo the harm they inflicted during the relationship and through their departure. Their suffering also doesn't indicate genuine change in their emotional capacity or relationship skills unless it motivates sustained therapeutic work and demonstrated behavior change over extended periods. Suffering alone doesn't create growth. Conscious effort and commitment to change do. Most importantly, understanding their suffering should reinforce rather than undermine your commitment to maintaining no contact and protecting your own emotional well-being. Their delayed grief response proves that no contact is working to protect you from their emotional unavailability while forcing them to confront natural consequences of their relationship patterns. The ultimate truth is that while their suffering may be genuine and severe, it represents the natural consequence of choosing emotional defense over love, independence over partnership, and fear over vulnerability. Your compassion for their pain should be balanced with recognition that this pain serves an important function in potentially motivating them toward the personal growth work they need to become capable of healthy relationships in the future.